So hello and welcome to another video about daily life with the BMW E32, and in this one I'm going to talk about the fuel pump, because as you might have seen from one of my other recent videos where I talk about the first year and 10,000 miles with the car, said pump has caused me a few problems. Now if you want the long story, watch the other video, but the upshot was that I thought it would be quite good to do a video covering the fuel pump relay and fuel pump test procedure, and also changing the pump itself, such that if you find yourself in the situation that I did last year, you'll know what to do. So let's start by having a look at the service manual in terms of testing the fuel pump and the relay, and then we'll move on to the practical side on the car after that. So this is the service manual. Picked up this PDF scan copy off eBay for not a huge amount of money. Always worth having the service manual for your vehicle if you're going to be doing any work on it. This is a Bentley product. They do a lot of manuals for cars. So the bit we're interested in today is in the engine section, section 1, subsection 160, fuel tank and fuel pump. So let's go and have a look at that. So here we go, fuel tank and fuel pump. The first bit is about fuel tank and the lines. We're not so interested in that today, because we're not taking the tank out or playing with the lines, other than to just disconnect them from the top plate on the fuel sender. It's the fuel pumps, and specifically the fuel pump fuse and relay, that we're interested in primarily, and operating the fuel pump for tests. There are a few warnings here in the manual which are all good idea to adhere to when working on the fuel system on the car, such as have a fire extinguisher to hand, and also when disconnecting the fuel lines if the car has recently run, which is possibly unlikely. If you're in a crank no start situation, there might be quite a lot of pressure still in the system, which will blow fuel out when you disconnect the lines. For example, they say to always unscrew the fuel tank cap to release pressure in the tank before working on the tank or lines. It's quite a good idea. You won't actually see me do that in the video later on, but I recommend it nonetheless. So tank and lines. So I will just dwell briefly on this image here, because this shows the pump and sender assembly. So when we go into the boot of the car later and take up the carpet panel and the little black access panel over the top, on top of the tank you'll see this plate here, which will have the two fuel lines to it, one the input line, the other the return line, and it'll also have a multi-way connector on the top. This is the fuel sender, which is fixed to the underside of said plate. Not actually touching the sender today, but when you take the plate out, the sender comes out with it because it's fixed to the bottom. It's a slightly awkward setup, to be honest. You'd be quite careful not to damage the sender because it's plastic and they get quite brittle with age inevitably. Mine wasn't working until it was freed up the last time the car was in the garage. This is the fuel pump assembly. Again, this will make more sense once we're actually on the car. But the fuel pump essentially sits vertically submerged in the fuel in the tank, and you've got your lines here, input and return, screen filter on the bottom, and then inside the tank there's a sort of plastic cradle which is fixed to the bottom. The pump then has a corresponding cradle insert that goes around it and that holds the pump in place, and that's how the pump is also released from the tank when you want to take it out. This diagram here I think is just for the 750i, which has two fuel pumps, but we won't worry about that today on the 730. So that is the pump assembly. Let's now have a look at the pump and relay. So fuel pumps, yeah, the electric fuel pump assembly is submerged in the bottom of the fuel tank. 735 and the 730. This manual just refers to the 735. I think it started for the American market, or it predates the 730, I can't remember, but it doesn't make any difference. So fuel pump, fuse and relay. So I'll demonstrate the relay on the car just very briefly. This is the e-box, which if you're sitting in the car is on the right hand side at the top of the engine bay by the bulkhead, and then the fuse box is on the left hand side. I think it's the same for both right and left hand drive cars. So when you open up the e-box, you'll see these three relays here, or in my case I don't have this relay here. I'm not sure if that's a model year thing or whether it's because I've got some non-standard wiring, but we're not worrying about that today anyway. Fuel pump relay and the main DME relay. The main DME relay can also cause problems, but let's just assume for the purposes of this that it's the fuel pump relay that is the possible culprit. The fuel pump is also protected by a fuse, fuse 23, so obviously that's the first port of call to check. If you suspect the fuse might have blown, check that before testing the relays. So during starting, the fuel pump runs as long as the ignition switch is in the start position and continues to run once the engine starts. If an electrical system fault interrupts power to the fuel pump, the engine will not run. So what we're going to do on the car is jumper the relay to get around the fact that normally the pump is only activated when cranking or the engine is running, and obviously if you're in a crank no start situation, particularly if you're by yourself, to test the power to the fuel pump you really need someone else to help you to crank the car, whereas by jumpering the relay, as we'll do in a minute, that eliminates that issue because it will feed power to the pump continuously. So operating the fuel pump for test. So if you're in a crank no start situation, this would be the first port of call really, normally to once you've been through the other kind of stuff like, do I have spark? Is there some reason to believe that the engine has randomly lost compression? Hopefully not. When you come to the fuel bit of your fuel ignition compression checks, the relay and the fuse obviously going to be the first port of call. So to operate a fuel pump for test purposes without having to run the engine, the fuel pump relay can be bypassed to power the pump directly, and we want to bypass its terminal 30 and terminal 87 with a fused jumper wire, and the pump should run even with the ignition off. And after completing the test, remove the jumper wire. Now BMW described in the manual that as a running the fuel pump for test purposes, but what you're doing initially there is eliminating the fuel pump relay as a culprit, because fuel pump relays are a very common culprit for any older fuel injected car. The fuel pump relays just relays, they get hot, they get worn out, and eventually they just stop working. So it's always a good idea to carry that jumper wire with you. I'll demonstrate the jumper wire in a minute, and that will make a bit more sense once we're actually on the car. So you do that, and then if at that point the car starts and runs, then the relay was probably your issue. But if it doesn't, the next port of call is to test the actual power to the pump at the back. So leaving a jumper in place, we want to see whether we've got power to the pump. So fuel pump electrical circuit. So this is quite a good diagram, electrical, but it's not necessary to understand this fully for what we're doing here. So to test for voltage, we've got our jumper in place. We then want to go to the luggage compartment, remove the floor carpeting and the the insulation panel. And once you've taken the access panel off the top, you will see, as I said earlier, you'll see this multi-way connector here. And when you disconnect it, you will see a fixed set of male pin connector pins on the top here that look something like this. Now obviously it's the female ends that you want to actually take your probes of your multimeter and insert into, because that's where the power is coming from, so obviously you need a multimeter for this. And you essentially want to test between the power and the ground. So this multi-way connector consists of both the power supply and the ground, and obviously you need to bridge the two. Test first of all, have you got continuity, but also have you got the voltage should be around 12 volts. And I'll just scroll on slightly better picture here. So we're talking about bridging the connectors. We've got pin 5 and the ground, which is pin 4 over here. So find those two and stick the connectors from the probes and multimeter together too. So that's probably enough of the service manual. I won't go over this with the multimeter on the car. I think it's fairly self-explanatory from the manual, but what I will do is just quickly look at the jumpering the relay in the e-box and then changing the pump itself if that's where your diagnosis takes you.
Right, so first port of call is the fuse box. Check that. Open it up. Got various fuses and relays in there. You should have this list on the back of the lid, which tells us that the fuel pump is number 23 or 24 if you've got two, and then you've got your numbers on the back there. So you can see actually that fuse looks all right. So we can put that back. If it's not, you should have one of these handy blade fuse removal tools on the back of the lid, and always keep a few spare fuses as well. Back. So relays in the e-box under here, and you just need a fairly chunky Phillips screwdriver to get into that. You've got screws basically at each corner here. So here's our fuel pump relay, and to test whether the relay was at fault, we want to jumper pin 87, pin 30, which equates to that socket there and that socket there. So take our jumper wire. This is a bit of wire with an inbuilt blade fuse holder, which I got from Halfords. Your blade fuse just goes in there. Service manual says to use a 16 amp, and then I just crimped two square connectors on the ends, which are approximately the same size as the blade connectors on the relay. So the only thing this doesn't have is a toggle switch. If you were going to be doing this on a regular basis, as per the manual, would be recommended to have a toggle switch such that you can put it in with the switch in the off position and then turn it on and off as required, rather than having to take the pins in and out to activate the circuit. But since we're just doing this for once, it's fine without a switch. Just be aware though that when you connect the two pins together, the pump will come on immediately, and you don't want to leave the pump running for too long without the engine running, because it's not good to pump fuel into the rail without it going anywhere. So for demonstration purposes, I'll just plug it in for long enough for the pump to run a little bit and then take it out again. So we put one end in, and when we put the other end in, we should hear a slightly high-pitched buzzing noise coming from the back of the car. You may also hear a bit of a hiss of fuel arriving to the rail. So there's a bit of background noise out here. I couldn't actually quite hear the pump, but I can hear a bit of fuel being delivered to the rail, so that tells me that the pump is working. So you then, leaving these in place, then go and try and start the car, and if it starts, then obviously that tells you that the relay was at fault. If the pump still doesn't run, then leave the jumpers in place, but then go to the back and check for voltage at the pump. Obviously with the relay in place, the pump will only get voltage when you're cranking, so if you're by yourself, it's easier to use the jumper rather than the relay and getting someone to crank the car. Right, so let's have a look at gaining access to the pump itself. Open the boot. Hope you don't have too much stuff in there. Come to the right hand side of the carpet panel, lift it up. Also take the insulation layer with you, and the pump is underneath that black access panel there, which has got a few small Phillips screws holding it in place. I won't go over the pump power test procedure. I think we covered that adequately on the computer, but I will just go over changing the pump itself. So before taking the panel out, we want to disconnect it from the electricity. Just this clip there. That disconnects both the power to the sender and to the pump. And then we just want to remove these two inbound return line as well. Obviously you might still have a bit of fuel pressure in here if the car's run recently. In this case we won't, because it's been cranked over quite a few times without the pump going. So we might have a little dribble, so I'm just going to grab a cloth, but it's not going to spray fuel at us. Anyway, just make sure that you remember which way round the two lines are. Slide this back a bit. Right, around the perimeter of the fuel pump module we have these little 10mm nuts, which I'm going to loosen off in turn. So attached to the bottom of the plate is the sender, and then the fuel pump itself is in a cradle inside the tank. But we've got to get the sender out first so that we can put our hand into the cradle and release the pump. Now the actual release procedure for the pump is a little bit fiddly, and it's a bit difficult to show you, but it's essentially, you put your hand in, and I'll demonstrate this a bit. It's a bit easier to demonstrate once the cradle is actually out. You essentially put your hand in and you should feel the pump. The pump is vertical in the tank, and either side of it, like that, should be like two clips. You squeeze together and then pull it up and out. Slightly offset to the left in the hole. I find it a bit easier to use my left hand. It should have some, depending on what you've got, whether you've got an original one installed or not, you may or may not have like this gold coloured bit on the top, so that's released quite easily actually, and just need to then get it out through the hole. Right, so as it is, just got to disconnect this bit at the top of the pump. So I've already loosened that off actually. I'll take that off. Now I just need to disconnect the two little electrical connectors, which, remember, you've got different sizes. These have just actually come off by hand. I think one's 10 and the other's 8, and that's just so that you don't get the positive and negative mixed up. So that is away now, so we can now take the pump out of the module, and just to expand on what I said earlier about how it comes in and out, as you can see here, that's the cradle. There's a receptacle, plastic receptacle for the cradle in the tank, and when you're putting your hand in to take it out, it's these two clips on the outside here that you press inwards to release it. So the pump should come with the inner part of the cradle, and essentially it pushes out downwards to release from the outer part of the cradle with these rubber clips on the side here. Disconnect all those. This is free. So here's our new pump, exactly the same. Actually quite a good replica of what the original Bosch or similar pump would have looked like. It's got this sort of bit on the top here, and I think that sort of filter bit on the bottom is similar. Anyway, let's get this back inside. So when we took it out, the orientation was with the fuel connector at the top here facing backwards, so that's the way I'm going to put it back in. So we want to put it back, offer it up back like that, and slot those little rubber slots back into the outer cradle again. Right, so we're just going to connect up our new pump now that's in the cradle. Fuel line back on. So now all we need to do is get it back in the cradle, which, as I said, is slightly offset to the left there. Quite a snug fit to get it in and out. Largely by feel, it has to do this. Try not to push it in down by holding the pump, because obviously the way the pump clips into the cradle, you might actually push the pump out the bottom of the cradle. So push on the outside where the two clips are that hold it in. Obviously for years the pipes have gone in a particular direction, and I try and match the direction which they sort of came out in. Back in. So yeah, there we go, that was the orientation. I'm just going to screw around each other.